David Seymour's cruelty has run deep for almost 2 decades. Let's take a deep dive into his past, his affiliations with the Atlas Network, his war against Indigenous rights and dignity, and much more. Start with Tom G. Palmer, Vice President of Atlas Network International Programs. While interviewing Palmer, David Seymour questioned if democracy is necessary.
Is it that we're actually have a case for rejecting democracy here, or is it that we need to rethink the rules of democracy?
Also, in his book Birth of a Boom, Saskatchewan's Dawning Golden Age, David Seymour suggested that one person, one vote isn't ideal because he implied that one person, one vote is a disincentive to a voter actually educating themselves on policy matters. But in 2022, Seymour was quick to claim that Labour was the one undermining democracy and that ACT was the true defender of one person, one vote.
I'm asking you to explain how it's democratic.
Well, democracy's changed, Jake.
So it's not a one person, one vote?
No. What I'm saying is democracy has changed.
It goes further. In 2010, Seymour posted an article online claiming that Tasmanian Aboriginal people regressed culturally. He completely ignored the genocide they faced during European colonisation. This isn't the only time Seymour downplayed Indigenous struggles. Seymour supported Paul Bunner, who downplayed the impact of Canadian residential schools on Indigenous communities. In one of his articles, Something for Everyone, Seymour praised an article by Paul Bunner that outright denies the genocide of Canada's Indigenous people in residential schools. Bunner's article and its supporters like Seymour is still harming Native Canadians to this day, as shown by this news report.
Canada's residential schools, a troubling relic of the past, but front and center today in Alberta's legislature.
The Premier must address the profoundly racist views of his speechwriter, who called the residential schools experience of Indigenous people a, quote, bogus genocide story.
That speechwriter, Paul Bunner. The opposition wants him fired for an article he wrote in 2013. In it, Bunner defends residential schools, arguing that the concept of cultural genocide could create violent insurgencies, calling settlements with survivors perverse financial incentives, and doubting that trauma caused by residential schools is passed on, saying it defies human experience. Canada's last residential school closed little more than 2 decades ago, a fresh wound yet to heal, torn open again by the words of a speechwriter and those that stand with him.
Seymour's stance here mirrors a pattern of disregarding Indigenous voices, one he's carried into New Zealand, trying to manipulate the Treaty of Waitangi into his own warped view. He has been attacking the treaty since at least 2011, as shown here.
Our Treaty of Waitangi, which is a great libertarian document that says everyone is equal before the law, is being renegotiated by Mr. Farrow's party into a partnership between two collectives along collectivist lines. Folks, personal liberties are important, but the way things are going, they are not urgent right now.
Seymour's connection to right-wing influences runs deep. Milton Friedman, a key figure behind inspiring Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile, publicly praised Don Brash, whom Seymour looks up to.
And Don Brash, who was appointed as the first governor of the Central Bank of New Zealand, is he's now the leader of the opposition in the New Zealand Parliament. But at the time, he came from business. He was a businessman, and he is an extraordinarily able and effective fellow. And he took this job on at the time when New Zealand had a very high inflation rate, and he succeeded in living up to his contract.
Friedman's impact even helped Atlas gain footing, while ACT continues to push policies inspired by this ideology. Senior fellow at David Seymour's Canadian think tank Frontier Centre for Public Policy, Wendell Cox said in October 2013 that Don Brash wrote an introduction for them. He then explains Bill English, who was then Deputy Prime Minister, wrote their introduction the year before.
Don Brash was the Reserve Bank Governor in New Zealand for about 14 years ago, and in fact, well, in any event, so anyway, he basically did an introduction for us to the Housing Affordability Survey, basically saying if you find prices out of line, you can bet that it is going to be urban containment policy. Bill English, the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, wrote our introduction this last year. They have just they've just passed within the last 2 weeks legislation to begin dismantling the urban containment policies that have created such a mess in New Zealand.
Roger Douglas and Ruth Richardson were listed in 2010 as the expert advisory panel for the Frontier Center for Public Policy at the same time Seymour was working there. So they were likely advising David Seymour while he was working there in Canada. Roger Douglas and Ruth Richardson also did a documentary with Atlas Network's Tom G. Palmer in 2017, alongside Don Brash and Richard Preble.
That helped a few people who were employed in that industry, but cost every other New Zealander, including the low income, a lot of money.
And in 1994, the job growth exploded. People were free to work.
New Zealand, I think, got the combination right. They reformed the private sector and they reformed the public sector basically at the same time.
Later in that same documentary, Johan Norberg, an award winner at the Atlas Network, spoke with disdain about the treaty.
The Treaty of Waitangi is still being used today as a guideline to help settle disputes. It's unusual in Western civilization that a 19th century treaty with indigenous people is still relevant today.
Despite David Seymour's claims that he has no connection to the Atlas Network, he joined a Liberty Forum event with them in 2020.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you, Brad. You know, my image of people is how they looked when I first met them, and you haven't changed.
And as if his views weren't questionable enough, Seymour's articles received fake praise, with exactly identical comments from supposedly different reviews. He has also been on the news over accusations of buying fake followers, after his followers on Instagram went up by 48,000 in a day. According to Modash, which is held up as being highly accurate, 58% of David Seymour's Instagram followers are fake. This line of apparently faking support is backed up by ex-ACT staffer Grant McLachlan. In 2021, he said the ACT Party created fake grassroots groups, or AstroTurfs, to manipulate and mobilize public opinion for political gain. He's even been recorded hinting he'd be fine with being bribed for influence.
We don't have any trump card funders. I doubt that any single funder contributes more than 5 to 10% of our funding in any given year, so nobody really has a veto on our work. Having said that, if anyone does want to give us that much money, please see me quietly after.
And if that isn't worrying enough, here is Danielle Smith at a lunch at the Frontier Center for Public Policy, while referencing David Seymour, boasting about just how much influence they have over governments.
We do not elect oppositions. We elect governments, always. As David said, every so often there are these seismic shifts in the political landscape in our province where we stand up and say to the government in charge, you've lost your way. And we create a new party as a new alternative with new ideas and new people who can come in, sweep the old group out.
Finally, Seymour mocked calls for Palestinian rights. In 2011, he mocked a student that was standing up for Palestinians against the atrocities committed against them, saying now if Day was a writer with a sense of irony, this would actually be quite funny. He's shown time and again that he has little regard for marginalized communities, both internationally and here in New Zealand.